Hello and welcome, or welcome back, as the case may be, to the Atlantean Archive. Thank you for taking time to stop by today. Now, if you follow BookTube reading events, you may know that the month of August is Garbaugust in the BookTube world. That's the month where we celebrate reading garbage or trashy fiction. I mentioned this in my previous video on the first two adult-level horror novels that I ever read. If you want to check that out, definitely trashy fiction. And I should mention by trash that I don't mean bad as in badly written, although some of it is, or necessarily exploitative or overly sexualized or gross type literature, anything like that. The trashy literature category is simply fun stuff to read. It can be in any kind of genre, but it's not considered sophisticated literature. So not for the more sophisticated, refined literary palates out there. Now, this event was created by a guy named Criminali. If you've never been on his channel, take some time to stop by, check him out, send him a shout out and a thank you for creating what is arguably the greatest BookTube event ever made. So a whole month of reading trashy fiction. And I knew that sooner or later I had to get around to novelizations. Novelizations are just default considered one of the trashiest categories of fiction. And of all novelizations, horror film novelizations have got to be the trashiest of all. I mean, we're scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel. We're rubbing our fingernails down to the nub here tonight, and it's a lot of fun. So what I want to talk to you about: two horror movie novelizations, both classic horror films that inspired entire franchises with films of questionable quality along the way. And I had never read any of these, either one of these two books that we're going to be talking about tonight. There's a very good reason for that. They are both hideously expensive in paperback. They're very difficult to find. You can find them. Amazon will charge you about $200 for these. I've seen these books even more expensive than that. It's possible to find them in the wild. I do from time to time see posts online from people who find them in Goodwill or thrift stores and whatever, and my hat is off. You know, we book collectors, we bow and do obeisance to those who are able to find stuff like this. But you can find it. But fortunately, in the electronic era, these things are available online as PDFs, so you can download them for free and read them if you're so inclined, if you're in the mood for something trashy. So the two books that we're going to be talking about are the two novelizations for, first of all, Halloween, 1978, John Carpenter's original film, and also Friday the 13th, again, the original film made in 1979 and released in early 1980. I think it was released sometime in the spring of 1980, yeah. So Halloween and Friday the 13th. We'll be talking about those tonight. Definitely trashy fiction. I'm typically not into slasher type fiction. It's just not something I read. I watched plenty of slasher films as a teenager, the Halloween movies, the Friday the 13th movies. Definitely watched all that back in the day, but it's not typically what I go after. But I was curious to read these books. And like I said, they're so expensive, I never got around to doing it until I found out they were available as PDFs. And I'm like, I've got to check these out. So, and they definitely have to be done for Garbaugust. So what I'm going to do, just give you a general overview of these two novelizations so you can decide whether or not you want to check them out and read them yourself. And then I may get into a little bit more spoilery material at the end, just because I have this thing for character and story. Even in trashy fiction, I like to dive in and ferret out some nuggets that I think may be of interest to you, especially if you don't intend maybe to read these books. You're not sure if you're ever going to get around to that, but you're curious and you want to know a few things. We'll get into that, but I'll give you some warning before I do that. So starting off with Halloween and the positives first. We'll go that way. The best selling point for the novelization, and this novelization, by the way, is written by a guy named Curtis Richards, although from what I understand, that's a pen name. The author's actual name is Richard Curtis. Now, you super fans out there may be able to tell me if that's accurate, but that's my understanding of it. So, Halloween by Curtis Richards. The best selling point for this book is that it provides you with detailed backstory. Now, many fans of the original Halloween film, or just the Halloween series in general, have often wondered, what's the deal with Michael Myers? Obviously, he's some kind of superhuman being, but is he possessed by an evil force? You know, what's going on with him? And a lot of people especially have that question where the first film is concerned. Well, you get a definitive answer in this book. You get a great backstory, an origin story leading up to Michael's attack on his sister Judith, which is how, of course, the original Halloween movie begins. So you get backstory leading you up up to that event, explaining how that took place. Why does Michael attack his sister? What's going on with that? You get a detailed explanation of what's going on there. You also get some detailed filler sequences. For instance, we're not really given a glimpse of Michael's life at the Smiths Grove insane asylum or the institution. Exactly, I can't remember the exact name in the movie, but you get an idea. You don't get an idea in the film, rather, as to what's going on, what Michael's doing there. You get pretty much the idea, especially from the clip in Halloween 2, or the televised version of the original John Carpenter's Halloween, that Michael is just sitting there in a chair staring off into the distance, not speaking to anybody. Well, the novel fills you in on what's going on at the Smiths Grove Sanitarium. Maybe that's the full name. It gives you the backstory. What did Michael do there? What was the trial like? You get information on that was interesting. Why does Dr. Loomis think that Michael is not, as is so obviously his opinion in the movie, an actual force of evil that has to be destroyed?
You fooled them, haven't you, Mike? But not me.
Why does Dr. Loomis instead not view him simply as a deranged individual who's more or less helpless to his own inclinations, or just a homicidal maniac, an ordinary maniac? Why does Dr. Loomis think that Michael is actually evil incarnate? Well, you get an answer in the novelization, and it's interesting how the author goes about spelling that out. Now, I don't know how much of this may have been originally scripted for Halloween and was cut out of the finished product. I do know that the novelization follows the theatrical release of the film very, very closely, although it does add this extra material in. So you don't get the TV scenes. Those of you who are in the know on this, you'll know that when Halloween was released on television, some additional scenes were shot around the same time as they were filming Halloween 2 to kind of pad the runtime on that. For instance, you get the scene where Linda comes over to Laurie's house to borrow a blouse. You get an extended sequence where Loomis is arguing that Michael be held in maximum security and he's denied. Those scenes were added for the TV version of the film, but the novel tracks with the theatrical release. So that's definitely the best, the big positive about seeking out the novelization. If you want answers to things like this, or you're just interested, that's the way to go. Definitely pick this up, give it a read, and see what you think. And if you have read this book, let me know what you think in the comments. And I'll get in, I guess, as I said, a little bit more spoilery material at the very end, give you some details on that some of you may not want right now. Another positive is the characters, the three girls, Annie, Laurie, and Linda. They're fleshed out pretty well. And I don't know how much of that is the backstory, a little bit of detail and the thought process that the author gives us, and how much of it is what was originally included in the Halloween movie script. Some of you who know trivia related to the making of the movie, you'll know that John Carpenter was writing about these teenage girls, these babysitters, but he didn't know exactly what to do with them. He wasn't, he didn't know what kind of dialogue would teenage girls would use, what's realistic. So his producer, who was also his wife or partner at the time, Deborah Hill, she wrote the dialogue for the girls. And I think it works pretty well. In the novelization, it's even more strongly 70s jargon than it is in the movie. But I think it works well, and it fleshes the characters out well. You do get into their thought processes, especially Laurie, since she's the main character there. You get pretty deeply into what's going on with her. This is another area where you get an answer to a question people have always wondered, in the original Halloween at least. Why does Michael go after Laurie? And then go after her friends? What's he interested in there? What's his motivation? Well, you get an answer here. Of course, in the second film, they told us that, Laurie was his sister. But before that was decided on, there was another reason for it. It's really pretty simple. The novelization gives you an answer to that. So things are fleshed out pretty well with the girls there. You also get into Michael's head, which you don't get in the movie. I mean, obviously you get the point of view shots of Michael stalking people, but you never actually get a glimpse into his mind, or what's there in place of a mind. What's driving him? What is he thinking? Is he thinking anything while he's doing all of this? Well, the novelization doesn't go into incredible detail on it, but there are a couple sequences where the author gives you a look into Michael's mind as he's stalking these girls and what it is that he's thinking and feeling as he's going about this. Mostly, though, you get that glimpse into Laurie's mind. She's thinking a lot about Judith Myers and why Michael killed her. It's obviously Halloween. It's the anniversary of all of this. So she's thinking pretty heavily on that. Of course, you may remember that in the movie, her father, who is a real estate agent in charge of selling the old Myers place where the murder took place, he's finally got a couple that's interested in buying the house, and he wants Laurie to drop the key off under the mat. So she does that in the movie. And of course, you see the silhouette of the shape of Michael in the doorway as she's walking away from it. So you get some more detail on that, and you get into Laurie's mind and why she's thinking about the original murder, what happened with Judith Myers, and all of that. Now, negatives in this book. Most people don't think of novelizations as being literature or respectable literature for the simple fact that a lot of them are not very well written, and unfortunately, this is a good example of that. If I were one of those people who had gone out and spent $100, $200 in search of this book, I would have been upset. If I was ever in a position to drop that kind of money for a paperback book, I would be upset because it's not very well written. Yeah, you do get that interesting backstory. You do get some decent character stuff going on. And there are segments of the book that come across okay. But overall, I got the impression that this may have been rushed, or that this was just maybe an initial draft or an earlier draft of the novel, that this wasn't really polished. I did run this past some people on social media, my initial impressions after reading these books, and I got some agreement on that. It's not a very well-written book. So that's something to be aware of. If you're interested in that backstory, you may have to wade through some very awkward prose to get the information you're after. So I definitely can't recommend it for the writing style. It's just not a very well-written book. Another is the sex scenes in the book. Now, in the movie, obviously, there's some of that going on, but it tends to be pretty brief. In the book, it really gets belabored. I mean, the scene between like Linda and her boyfriend is 3 pages long. So that was annoying to me. I wished it had been much shorter. I think he could have done more interesting things than giving us details of teenagers having sex. So that's something to be aware of with this as well. That's another thing that I guess that people don't have a whole lot of respect for the horror genre, in particular horror literature. I mean, unless your last name happens to be Poe or Lovecraft or Stoker, you're not going to get a lot of respect to begin with. And a lot of it has to do with the cliches, including a lot of the over-sexuality in both the movies and the books. But I guess on the whole, though, to be fair to it, this is not any more sexual than anything you're going to find in Stephen King. Stephen King writes stuff like this. So, and I don't like it when I read it in King either. So I tend to skip that stuff, especially some of the weird stuff that King gets into. So that's my general overview of it. A lot of interesting backstory, a lot of interesting filler material. There are a few differences with what we saw in the movie that you might be interested in. Michael's fight with Laurie is a little bit different. A couple of the other incidents in the movie are a little bit different in the book. The murder with Linda, who played by P.J. Souls in the movie, that's a little bit different, but not drastically so, but there are some differences there. It's mainly the final confrontation between Michael and Laurie where you'll notice the differences there. So that's enough for that one for now. Moving on to Friday the 13th by Simon Hawke, and I think he wrote the first 3 novelizations for the first 3 movies there. I went into this expecting even less from the Halloween book, because Halloween, the novelization, is treated like one of the holy grails of book collecting. People go gaga over trying to find this book. You don't hear as much about Friday the 13th, so I thought, well, maybe it's just not that good. But honestly, I was surprised when I read it. It's better. It's definitely a better written book than the Halloween book is. So it's got that going for it. It's shorter than the Halloween book, which is kind of funny, but it's actually a lot better. The writing is just more polished. It's smoother. It follows the plot of the movie very, very closely. You don't get a whole lot of extraneous material. But again, the author does take the room that he has to delve into the thoughts of the characters. So he brings the counselors to life a little bit better than what you get even in the film. And I found that made me sympathize with them even more. Typically, he goes into detail before these characters are killed. Of course, a couple of them are only on screen for a few minutes in the movie, so you don't get much time with them anyway. But I liked that about the book. He really brought them out, made them more human, made them more relatable. Some people that have read the book, I was looking at some comments and listening to some reviews this week before I did this. Some people don't like that fact. They wish there had been less of that, but maybe they're fans of the blood and gore, and that's what they're after. And they don't want as much character development. I don't know. But I personally liked it. So if you enjoy that kind of thing as well, you will probably like the Friday the 13th novelization better than the Halloween novelization. You don't get that backstory as much with this one because there's really not a whole lot in the way of backstory to tell. You know the story of Pamela Voorhees. You know how Jason's origin story. You do get more into her mind at the very end. When she finally shows up. And the book does follow the movie in that way. Just like the movie keeps the killer's identity a secret until the very end, the book does the same. So you don't get into killer's head until the very, very end. And then you get a lot of development that maybe gives you a little bit more sympathy for Pamela Voorhees than you might have had in the movie, where she just shows up and she's this maniacal killer. I mean, obviously she's lost her son under tragic circumstances. She blames the people who should have been watching them. But the novel explains a little bit more about how this is built up in her head and why it's driving her and why she is stark raving insane by the point that we encounter her in the film. Although you wonder, with a person like that, how has Pamela Voorhees held a job? How has she survived all these years? I mean, the movie takes place in 79? Her son died in the 50s. How has she survived all of this time? I mean, can you see her working a day job, flipping burgers at some place and bumping people off, on her off hours? It's one of those things that kind of occurs to you, or it occurs to me anyway, and things I ask. So you definitely have a better written story. There's more character development. I personally thought it was a much better read than the Halloween novel. You also, of course, get into Alice's mind. You have kind of that omniscient view at the very end of the story, switching back and forth between Mrs. Voorhees and Alice as they're facing off with each other, and that was interesting as well. One of the reviewers that I was listening to, who did not like all the character development in the story, really, really, really liked the last few chapters. He said they absolutely flew and just really drew him into the story. So he was all about that and wished that the rest of the book had been that way. So it's got a great conclusion to it. I think it plays out very well. It's easy to go hokey with that, with some of those action sequences, if it's not handled right. And I don't know that even I, as a writer, really have a full grasp on how to do that in a really compelling way. I try. I do some of that in my own book, Descend in Darkness. Yes, plug for the book. But it's handled much better than in Halloween. Some of the action sequences toward the end of Halloween get really clunky. And that's another example of why this book is so much better written, in my opinion. So that's another factor to recommend it. Negatives, I really don't have many to complain about in this book. It's just that much better of a novelization. You do get a little bit of sexual references in the book. There is obviously the one sex scene between Kevin Bacon and his girlfriend, or Kevin Bacon's character in the movie and his girlfriend, but that's tame compared to what's in Halloween. It's kind of over and done. And then it's mostly a lot of him and her thinking about it afterwards. So it's definitely much more tame. For a movie with a reputation for being violent, the book is actually pretty tame. So that was kind of a surprise to me. A surprise overall. I enjoyed it better than the Halloween novel, aside from the backstory you get in Halloween. So I don't want to belabor this too much, but that is the general overview of the books. I definitely would recommend Friday the 13th over Halloween just because of the writing style, but you do get all that backstory with Halloween that you may be very interested in. I did find it interesting. All right, so moving on with a couple little more spoilery things for those of you who are not sure you're ever going to get around to reading these books, but you're curious. You just want to get into it a little bit more. You want to get those free nuggets. I'll just go ahead and throw this out here. Fans have always wondered what's going on with Michael. Is Michael possessed? Yes. Answer, yes, he is possessed by an evil spirit. At the very beginning of the book, you get the story of an ancient Celtic tribe where a young man who has some deformities falls in love with a beautiful young woman, and she is terrified of him, thinks he's a monster like other people in the village do, and they spurn him and tend to isolate him. And eventually, she is betrothed to a handsome young man from a good family, as you might imagine. And he's at the wedding ceremony, and they're doing their some kind of ceremonial wedding dance. And this young man who's been spurned, he's sitting there in the crowd. And as the happy couple comes by him, dances their way past him, he jumps out and kills both of them with a knife. The villagers pounce on him, literally tear him to pieces, and they curse him to be restless, his spirit to be restless in the earth, to find no rest. And, this is kind of one of those things where you're reading it and you see stuff like this in movies and other books where somebody will do something horrible and then they'll be executed and they're like, may you lie and never rest. This kind of thing. May your spirit wander the earth forever. And you're like, thank you very much. You've taken this person who is evil and dangerous and you killed them and made them an immortal spirit and denied them rest. So now they're going to wander through the earth spreading havoc. Thank you for that. You kind of wonder what goes into people's heads. But it's just one of those fun things to think about. Does it ever occur to these people who are cursing these spirits and sending them out that they're just going to go and do more of the same? Only now they can't be killed, usually, or at least easily. So that is Michael's origin story. You get this evil spirit, this jealous spirit who hates happy lovers, basically. And this spirit infects Michael's family. It's his grandfather or his great-grandfather, I can't remember which one, had terrible nightmares and was driven to violent acts. And as the book opens, Michael is also having very bad nightmares. He's being urged to kill. He's being urged to be violent. And his mom is talking to his grandma about this as they're putting the finishing touches on Michael's clown suit. So that is the origin story for Michael and what's actually driving. He is possessed by this spirit. When he sees his sister Judith with her boyfriend later that night, this spirit fully comes over him and overwhelms him with its insistence that he kill her. And that's exactly, of course, what he does. Then, as I mentioned previously, we get some information about Michael's trial. He's this little angelic boy who has never done anything wrong before, that any kind of serious way, and now he's accused of this brutal murder. He stabbed his sister over 30 sometimes, and people have a very difficult time believing he could have done a thing like that. So for a while they're thinking maybe he's covering up for somebody else who did the murder, or he's afraid of them. It takes him a long time to come to terms with the fact that he actually did it. And then the judge is very reluctant to assign him to the sanitarium. He thinks he'll be abused there. But actually, the opposite turns out to be true. Michael more or less takes over the juvenile wing of the sanitarium. And he does this in a very calm way. He initially speaks pretty normally, seems to interact like a normal child, seems almost like nothing ever happened. Yeah, you brutally murdered your sister. He's just walking around having, an ordinary time, acting like an ordinary little boy. But things begin to happen. And Dr. Loomis notices that Michael has an unusually strong hold over the other kids and even over the staff members there. And he also notices that the very few people who tick Michael off or deny him what he wants for some reason or another end up having bad things happen to them. And the problem that Dr. Loomis has is he knows Michael is somehow responsible, but he doesn't know how. He doesn't know how he's able to do this because he's never around when these things happen. There's no way to directly link him to the accidents that these people have. And he begins to get that feeling that there's a lot more going on to Michael. This is how he ultimately comes to believe that Michael himself is a force of evil. There's a Halloween party at the sanitarium. Believe it or not, they have a Halloween party, and Michael requests it. And Dr. Loomis is kind of blown away by that. He's like, you, of all people, want to have a Halloween party? But Michael says, well, the other kids want to do it, and the staff say they're okay with it if you are, so why not? And Loomis gets to thinking, well, maybe this is my chance to draw Michael out, to learn more about what's going on in his psyche, and also give him a chance to mess up. And they do have an incident. They're bobbing for apples. There's a girl ahead of Michael in the line. She's bobbing for apples, and I can't remember what she does, but she did tick Michael off in some way. And the lights go out. When the lights come back on, she's face down in the water. Michael is standing off to the side, apparently innocent of it. Again, frustratingly, Loomis can't connect him with it. They revive the girl. She's okay, but Loomis at this point is absolutely convinced there's something evil in Michael that is reaching out and destroying people and is driving him to destroy people. So you get that. Another detail that I mentioned previously that I'll go into a little more here. Why does Michael stalk Laurie? It's very simple. When she goes to put the key under the mat at the old Myers place, Michael is in the house. He sees her, and she reminds him of his sister. She's another thin, blonde girl, reminds him of Judith, his sister, the one he killed, the one he was driven to kill, the one that the thing in him hates pretty young girls like this. And he becomes obsessed with her, starts following her around, and by extension, her friends. So yeah, it's dangerous at this point to know Laurie Strode. So Michael's got no vendetta against her friends. They're just there as convenience kills. So that's really the backstory behind that. You get into Michael's head a little bit more, as I mentioned. And that's really what you find out. He's following them around and taking advantage of this. Michael does have superhuman strength and endurance, as it's implied, obviously, how difficult it is to injure him, and nobody's managed to kill him yet. Of course, at the end of the movie, Dr. Loomis thinks he has, and he survives. And it's evident that the spirit is driving him, giving him this strength, giving him the ability to do these things that no ordinary human could do. So you get a lot in terms of those extra details. I'm trying to think if there's anything else here. One thing that always struck me as a little bit weird in the movie is the fact that Laurie is so dismissive of Tommy Doyle when he comes and tells her he's seen the boogeyman. I mean, you've literally been stalked by a guy with a white mask all day. You've seen him around. You're scared of him. He pulls up in a station wagon watching you and your friends and then takes off. So when Tommy tells you that he sees a guy standing around outside, why would you automatically doubt that? Well, in the book, it's even more strange that Laurie would do that, because she becomes obsessed thinking about Judith Myers after she leaves the house that morning. She's wondering what it would be like to be killed that way, how horrible that would be. And then she sees Michael stalking her. She's really weirded out a lot of the way through this story, more so than she is in the movie. So you would think, based on that, even more, she would be willing to believe Tommy when he says he sees the boogeyman outside just standing around. But she doesn't. So that kind of stands out as a point in the story that really doesn't make that much sense. It doesn't seem consistent, but, nitpick. It's a horror movie, and it has a plot for certain reasons. So, make of that what you will. Anyway, don't have too much more spoilery that I can reveal about the Friday the 13th novel, other than Pamela Voorhees went back to work at Camp Crystal Lake after the death of her son. They took her back because they felt bad for her. She wanted to protect the children, and she became very resentful of the camp counselors. And all she could hear in her mind over and over again was Jason screaming for help. And that, combined with her resentment of the counselors, led her to just, over time, get to sort of the point that Michael does in the Halloween novel before he kills his sister. He just can't get the voice out of his head. So she's constantly being driven to comfort the voice of her son, who was neglected and died and drowned in the lake. And she chooses to comfort him by taking revenge on the people that should have been watching him. So that's her driving factor. That's why she has been completely driven insane. Makes her a little bit more of a sympathetic character, although obviously she's still a brutal murderer. But that's the only thing I could think of by way of really going into detail, other than just the backstory you get in the characters thinking about their lives, which, as I said, was interesting. So that is Halloween and Friday the 13th, the original films, the novelizations of these films, again, available as PDFs, unless you have the gold doubloons to drop for paperback copies of this, or you happen to have a magic... have a wand or a dowsing rod that you can find these books available in some thrift store someplace, and then best of luck to you. You'll find the grail of horror novelization fiction. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Please consider subscribing to the channel, sharing the content. And until next time, beware of the boogeyman.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact, it was.